All right. Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for being here for day two of Choose Clean Water Coalition's training of resilient waters, making the clean water climate change connection. Had a great first day on Monday and have another great lineup here for day two. So really excited to have you again. And let's go ahead and get started. Um, First, just want to acknowledge the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. It's their support that made this training possible. The support is actually supposed to go towards our 2020 Choose Clean Water Conference, which for reasons outside of our control, but we've hosted many virtual trainings over the past year and a half, which have been really great. And this is actually the last one of those. So thank you again to NIFWIF, as we often call them in this world of alphabet soup that we live in. All right, so just a few housekeeping items. We've all been doing Zoom for a long time now, but please make sure you're muted. I'll be monitoring the chat for any questions, so please feel free to drop those in the chat, and I'll bring them up as it makes sense, as it's timely to the presentation, or we might get to them at the end. Or if you prefer to ask your question orally, then you can just hold on to them, and each presentation will have time for Q&A at the end. And last but not least, please complete the evaluation. I'm going to drop it in the chat here now if you want to just open it up and plan to complete it after the training this morning. It would only take you a few minutes, and we really do take your feedback to heart when it comes to developing future trainings and events. So we'd really appreciate it if you just take a few minutes to share your thoughts after the presentations this morning. Want to just give a really quick recap of day one for those that weren't able to make it. We established how everyone wants clean water, and that our work for clean water is climate change work, but we're failing to talk about it. And a lot of it's going to be about changing the narrative, which we'll learn more about with Sarah's presentation later this morning. Brief overview of the two projects. We heard from Joe Rieger of the Elizabeth River Project and their restoration of a brownfield site, and at the Money Point Restoration Project, and how that set ERP on the path towards more climate resilience projects. And then following Joe, we heard from Holly Gallagher and Natalie Cohen of the National Wildlife Federation and their amazing work building schoolyard habitats and restoring vacant lots in Baltimore and Philadelphia. And those projects highlighted numerous benefits that touched on both on clean water and improving resilience, but also helped reduce polluted runoff, created critical habitat for pollinators, provided educational opportunities in the community, and not a small piece, it created a lot of good jobs as well. I did drop, I'll drop it again, the YouTube recording, if folks are interested in going back and either rewatching it, or if you weren't able to make it on Monday, you can go back and watch that too. And also recording this presentation as well, and we'll also put that online for you to look at later if you'd like. So just brief look at our agenda. You can see Resilient Day 1, that will be your resource to look at the first day's training. That's the same thing, directs to the same YouTube link. But then we're going to hear from Jeff and Jeb here shortly from Lancaster Farmland Trust. We're going to have a break, and then we're going to have our communications training from Sarah Bucci at the Water Hub at Climate Nexus before we wrap up. All right, so let's dive into our first presenters. So Jeff Swinehart is the Chief Operating Officer of the Lancaster Farmland Trust. He's been with the trust for 15 years and has 21 years of land trust experience in total. During his time at the trust, Jeff has built an easement portfolio to more than 500 easements and 30,000 acres, which is the largest easement portfolio in Pennsylvania. And also presenting with Jeff is Jeb Musser, who is the Director of Land Protection at Lancaster Farmland Trust, and he's been with the trust for 10 years. Manages their programs in farmland preservation, implementation of best management practices on farms, and fee-for-service activities. Anyone that's been in the Chesapeake Bay world knows that it's no secret that reducing agricultural pollution in Pennsylvania is crucial to improving water quality in Pennsylvania's rivers and streams, and ultimately the Bay. And no place is more critical in Pennsylvania than Lancaster County. We'll hear from Jeff and Jeb that a large portion of Lancaster County farms are managed by Plain Sect farmers, which is, well, I'm really excited to hear Jeff and Jeb discuss their work engaging Plain Sect community leaders in efforts to increase adoption of farm conservation practices, BMPs, going back to alphabet soup. So with that, really excited to have Jeff and Jeb here with us this morning, and you guys can take it away.
Get myself unmuted here. Thanks, Drew. Appreciate the introduction. Appreciate everyone's interest in attending, these sessions that the Choose Clean Water Coalition is offering. A great organization that helps to advocate for a lot of work in the Chesapeake Bay watershed, which I think we all know that, but has been a great resource for us, and we're always happy to talk about the work that we're doing here in Lancaster County. So I'm going to give a brief overview of the organization and a bit on Lancaster County, and then kick it over to Jeb, who's going to talk more specifically about the project that we'd like to cover, which is a project down in Salisbury Township, which is in the eastern side of Lancaster County. But to start this off, just to touch on the mission of Lancaster Farmland Trust, which is to preserve and steward the productive farmland of Lancaster County, for a variety of reasons. Obviously, agriculture has a long history in Lancaster County. It makes up the bulk of our landscape. It's critical to our local economy. There's employment of about 52,000 people in agriculture. If you drive around the county,
I'm presenting on a conference, but
if you drive around the county, you'll see roadside stands around, and you can, select fresh produce and things of that nature. So, its availability is extensive. A lot of people like to cycle, ride bikes through the countryside because it's just really beautiful, and all that sort of adds up to this amazing quality of life that we have here in Lancaster County, which is a population is still increasing. We expect our population to increase by 100,000 people by 2040, and how do we accommodate that growth, and what's that impact on water quality, and relative to what's that impact related to climate change as well. So we're going to kick it off with a poll though at first, just to test people's knowledge a bit about Lancaster County in Pennsylvania. So Drew, I think you're going to tee up the poll here.
All right, here we go.
So we give you a couple of minutes to go down through. You'll see it's a sliding bar on the right hand side, and there should be 4 questions there. And I guess we'll insert, nobody can do the quick Google search to figure out what any of these answers are. They got to be honest sort of guesses. I can see some starting to come through now. Looks like 100 to 200 acres on the average farm size is leading the horse race here. You can see, looks like some people have some good knowledge about Lancaster County here. So still seeing a few more responses come in here. So we'll give it just another few seconds or two. All right, so looks like most people responded with 100 to 200 acres, average farm size throughout the country. It's actually the one below that, 300 to 400 acres would be the correct answer there. So as you'll see on the next question related to Lancaster County, what's the average farm size? And everyone was, 46% of you were correct in that one. 50 to 100 acres. I think our actual average farm size in the county is about 72 acres. We do an extensive amount of work in the Plain Sect community, that being the Old Order Amish and conservative Mennonite communities. About 80% of our work are with members of those communities, and their farm size average right around 62 acres. that we see. It's a pretty good number on an annual basis for us. And then looking at what percentage of Pennsylvania dairy farms are located in Lancaster County. So this is the 25% number. It seems like most people thought there was more dairy farms, more of the Commonwealth's dairy farms in Lancaster County. I would say historically, dairy was a very significant part of the landscape. Obviously, over the last number of years, there's been significant challenges in the dairy industry in terms of pricing. We've seen a lot of dairy farmers really move out of the industry and sell their herds. It's pretty common right now to drive around Lancaster County and see a lot of empty dairy barns. Farmers are still holding on to their land, they're still farming it, but we have seen transition into more niche markets, especially for the smaller farms, which typically are the Amish farms. So, they'll transition in and start doing either more produce or get into more pasture-based type of products, or start doing some more retail type related things like flowers and things of that nature. So we have started to see that transition related to water. One positive of that is we have less livestock in terms of dairy cows. And if you drive around the county, it's very common to see a lot of dairy cows in pastures, and pastures seem to fall in stream corridors. So we have seen the ability and farmers' willingness to install riparian buffers at a higher percentage than what we historically have seen, because they don't have the livestock intensity on their farm anymore. So that has been one positive aspect related to an environmental impact of the declining dairy industry in the county. And then what percentage of farms are farmed by the Plain Sect community? It is about 50%. No one really knows the true number, but for us living and working here, just our awareness of the county, 50% is probably a pretty good number. And it appears as though the trend is, as farms come up for sale, the likelihood that a member of the Plain Sect community is going to acquire that farm is significantly higher, especially in some parts of the county. So we see that sort of expansion of the community throughout the county. So enough with polls at this point. So a little bit about our work, a couple of prongs to our work. So we do a significant amount of easement acquisition, which is the preservation of farmland. Drew mentioned this in the introduction. Currently, we've preserved 535 farms. It's just under 32,000 acres here in Lancaster County. Primarily, we have done a small amount of work in the western part of Chester County, which is the county just to the east of us. A small amount of work in Dauphin County, which is an adjacent county to the north, and have started to do some work out in Cumberland County, which is also still part of the Bay watershed. But if you take our success and add in the Lancaster County Ag Preserve Board, which is the state county farmland preservation program, there's over 1,500 farms permanently preserved in Lancaster County, represents over 115,000 acres, which Lancaster County has the designation of having the most preserved farmland of any other county in the entire nation. So that's great, to have that land permanently protected so it's not converted into some other use. The critical piece is to ensure that we have good management practices on all of those farms, which really leads into sort of the next area of our work, which is really providing that financial and technical assistance to farmers, both preserved and non-preserved farmers, to ensure that they have those management practices. And this is an area of our work that has really grown over the last decade or so. As we saw the need to work with farmers. Farmers are challenged on multiple fronts in terms of implementing practices, from just the complexity of programs to the lack of the technical assistance and the lack of the financial assistance. So it runs the gamut there. And my board really felt compelled that part of our mission was ensuring that the farmland throughout Lancaster County is stewarded in a good manner. And then obviously that has great impacts to water quality here locally, as well as regionally, and then ultimately the Chesapeake Bay. But as Drew touched on, climate change, is something that we all know is real and serious, and it's something that historically we didn't focus a lot on. We're placing a much more higher focus on climate change factors. I would say it isn't necessarily climate change as a selling point to farmers. I sort of joke that with farmers, if you talk about, climate change, they look outside and they go, yeah, it's the sun's shining and it's not raining, but it could be raining tomorrow. I deal with climate change sort of every day in terms of different weather patterns. So that climate change isn't necessarily a buzzword that's going to resonate with most farmers in Lancaster County, I would say. But talking about the particular practices that improve the economic performance of their farm. So when you think about in the context of talking about continuous cover crop and no-till, which, as we all know, is a great way to sequester carbon. But from a farmer's perspective, that's less trips he has to take across the field. If he's not out there working that soil, he doesn't have to take his team, or if it's a mechanized farm, they don't have to expend the amount of fuel and wear and tear on equipment, taking multiple trips across that field. And if they can maximize and experience the same yields in terms of their crop, it's sort of a no-brainer. And we've seen a great transition throughout the landscape of farmers in Lancaster County implementing continuous no-till and cover crop practices. Much of it isn't captured and isn't reported because a lot of it is voluntarily implemented and not being documented in ag erosion and sedimentation control plans, which is really what the state, Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, and DEP is looking at for reporting purposes back to the EPA. So that's something that we're trying to address there as well. And then the third area is really work with a lot of municipalities in terms of their local land use policies, ensuring that we can keep our agricultural open and available for agricultural use. But, more recently working with them in terms of are there opportunities to implement policies in terms of riparian corridors to help provide protection there? Is there opportunities to implement local policies that would require presenting a ag erosion and sedimentation control plan when a farmer comes in for a permit for something? Maybe he's doing an expansion onto a barn and he needs a building permit. So trying to inject other mechanisms in there as a check and balance to ensure that farmers have the necessary plans in place and ensuring that they're implemented. And then moving on to the next slide, Jeb's driving all the slides here, so touched on a bit of this, our conservation work. We do a fair amount of outreach. We have one full-time person, Gordon Hoover, that does a lot of outreach. I mean, he's literally out on farms every day. He is a farmer, has a farm actually in Salisbury Township that Jeb's going to be covering. Had a dairy operation for decades, worked for Land and Lakes as a relationship manager with some of their producers for a number of years, and is also a township elected official. So he knows agriculture, and what we have seen over our experience is the ability to have someone to go out to talk with farmers that can really walk the walk with farmers, that has a deep understanding of agriculture and can really get down in the weeds, for lack of better words, about challenges of agriculture. And what we find is farmers test people that come out. They want to test to see how much street cred you have when it comes to agriculture. And if you're not able to demonstrate, that level of credibility, you've almost immediately lost the opportunity to work with them. Because they want to work with someone who understands the challenges and the frustrations that they have on a daily basis. And Gordon does a great job of that. We've recently also added another part-time person to do some of that outreach work as well. But at this point, we probably, over the last handful of years, have been out in 12 different townships now throughout Lancaster County, and probably have had face-to-face visits on farms, probably close to 2,000 farms at this point throughout the county. And in comparison, there's about 5,500 farms in Lancaster County. And then trying to get that technical assistance out to them. So obviously we're tapping into virtually every funding opportunity that's out there. National Fish and Wildlife Foundation is a great one that's funded the particular project that Jeb's going to talk about. But that led into funding from the State Conservation Commission, as an example, and some other partners that Jeb will talk about that we have. But we're accessing funds at the state level through DEP, through Growing Greener, through private foundations, and really, any possible avenue, because farmers are really challenged. Agriculture is not a very profitable business today, if there is any profit. And if there is profit, the primary concern for many farmers is they have a feed bill to pay, they have to feed their family, and most of them have a mortgage payment. And those become priorities, and the aspects of disposable, quote, disposable income to invest into their operation for something that does not provide an immediate return is very challenging. And as we get into some of the more structural improvements that we provide some financial assistance on, it's very common to see expenses in $150,000 to $250,000 in terms of improvements on farms, and farmers just don't have that capital. And in many cases, they don't have access to that capital. And some of what drives that is the land values in Lancaster are fairly significant, and they keep rising. So the availability of cash on hand or access to capital to do some of these improvements really becomes challenging for farmers. And that's why, again, we're out trying to turn over every stone that we can find, trying to get dollars in. And then obviously, we're part of the Lancaster Clean Water Partners, working collaboratively, across the county. So, we are directing farmers to other partners that we might be engaged with, whether that's the Alliance for the Chesapeake Bay, whether that's the Stroud Water Research Center, whether it's the local conservation district, and great partnerships with the local TSPs, the, Red Barn Consulting and the Team Ag Consulting, and really trying to direct farmers to whatever programs are best suited for them. So just some overview of the work that we do there. Before we kick it over to Jeb, specifically about the project, Drew, I think we'll launch our next poll here.
Okay. Let's go. Here we go.
All right, so another series, I believe it's 4 questions here. Again, you can scroll down on the right. These are more of opinion type questions. So there's not necessarily any right or wrong answer, I would say, although we can touch on some of these. Obviously, question number 3 is not an opinion question. There's a defined number for Commonwealth in terms of, pounds of nitrogen that need to be reduced. And also number 4 is a very definitive number that here in Lancaster County, we know well in terms of the percentage of reduction that has to happen here in Lancaster. So I'll just give everyone a few minutes to run through those poll questions. Again, just as a reminder, if you do have a question, feel free to pop it in the chat. Drew was monitoring that. If it's relevant to the current discussion, Jeb and I are certainly open to take that, but if it makes more sense to wait until the end of the presentation, we'll address questions there. We're going to let Drew make the decision there of whether he thinks it's relative to inject during the conversation or whether it makes sense to pause and wait. So I see questions are starting to populate through here, which is good. We're at about 44% now coming through. Okay, I see we're at about, oh, still populating here. We're at about 64% right now. Just as some narrative, as last couple of questions are coming here. Obviously, we all experienced some very significant rain events here over the last few weeks. There was a lot of discussion here in Lancaster County about, how those significant floods impact existing BMPs, especially riparian corridor BMPs, and hearing from a lot of partners across the county that many of those BMPs were stabilized and continue to remain, which obviously is a good positive sign. Always some concern when you have significant rain events. What does that do to some of this green infrastructure that's out there? So it's great to see that it is resilient, and that it is withstanding some of the excessive rain events that we have that are being caused by climate change factors. All right, I'm not seeing any more come through, so I think we can probably close the poll at this point. So we have, in terms of the main contributor to pollution, local waterways in the Bay, 35% being excess manure and fertilizer. I would say from our experience here at Lancaster Farmland Trust, we would agree with that. That does seem to be this most significant challenge for farmers. We see a lot of good field-based practices out on farms. The challenge really is those structural improvements. And again, from what I referenced before, many of the challenges associated with that is just access to the capital to be able to implement that. Farmers just don't have it. And farmers aren't necessarily, well versed and skilled at working through, working with an engineering on design, particular practice, and how do you put that out to bid, and how do you engage with contractors, and how do you work through the contract and all those sort of elements. It's just not the expertise of a farmer. And that's where organizations like ours can sort of step in and be that third party that helps facilitate that process. What are the main barriers to making water quality improvements? Insufficient funding. That's a big one. It's certainly a big one. I would say also, we do hear the complexity of programs is a significant barrier as well. Especially, and we see this a lot, when you have multiple groups that might be working in the ag industry that are out there talking about programs, but they're all talking about different programs. That becomes very confusing for farmers when they may have representatives from 2 or 3 different organizations visit them all within 30 or 60 days of one another, all talking about different programs. It becomes very confusing for farmers. So I would say that's one aspect here in Lancaster County in terms of a strategy that we've launched about focusing on a delisting strategy, in particular catchments. And we've identified a catchment lead there to really be the point person and organization out cultivating those relationships. And everyone's carrying the same message in different catchments. So that's helped to eliminate some of the confusion out there, but also the uncertainty and future of agricultural operations. Again, agriculture, it's a very tough business these days. The impacts of COVID-19, how that impacted agricultural operations in terms of the commodity markets and those sort of things was pretty great. And just the uncertainty, that we see and escalating, input costs associated with agriculture it's certainly a challenge. And the lack of trusted relationships is something we always reference as well. So, all of these are really relevant aspects. In terms of the pounds of nitrogen that needs to be reduced in Pennsylvania, 34 million pounds is the correct number there. So that is that's a big number, especially in relationship to what Lancaster County needs to do, which is the 21% of that 34 million pounds. So that's significant in terms of what has to happen here within Lancaster County, and 80% of that needs to be in agriculture. So, we know that agriculture is going to be the primary driving force. And I think it's safe to say that the success or failure of the Commonwealth in terms of meeting Chesapeake Bay objectives, one is going to be on the backs of farmers, and 2, it's going to be on the back of Lancaster County. So we got to make sure that we're successful here in Lancaster County. And then finally, the last question here is, which statement do you believe to be most true when it comes to agriculture and climate change? Preserved and sustainable farms are important to combat climate change. We would agree with that 100%. It's something, and we were fortunate in a past NIFWIF grant where we actually could bring those two things together, where we were working with farmers to permanently preserve their farms, but at the same time implementing the necessary practices on those farms. And we think that really is the strategy moving forward. One, it keeps those farms from being converted to non-agricultural uses. We're out there every year because we're an accredited land trust and we're required to be out there once a year to monitor those farms so we can check on those BMPs to ensure that they're in place. And it keeps up that relationship with the farmer. So as they may experience operation and management challenges with those BMPs, we can provide guidance and resources there if necessary. So we do here at Lancaster Farmland Trust really believe that that's the most important in dealing with climate change aspects here in Lancaster County. And with that, I am going to pass it over to Jeb to talk about the Salisbury Township project.
All right, thanks, Jeff. Good morning, everybody. As Drew and Jeff mentioned, my name is Jeb Musser, Director of Land Protection here at Lancaster Farmland Trust, and I'm going to dive into more of the specifics of one particular project we worked on here over the past few years, and actually are still, kind of a continuous improvement project. We're continuing to build on that as more funding comes into the mix. So just a little bit of background on the project. I'm assuming most are probably familiar generally with the general location of Lancaster County. The map here on your screen, you can see Lancaster County there, kind of in the southeastern portion of the tan area of the Chesapeake Bay watershed, right along the Susquehanna River. The Chesapeake Bay really not all that far from Lancaster County. And the map on the right kind of zooms in on Lancaster County, can show you some more specifics on the project we're going to be talking about. So Salisbury Township, I believe the second largest township in Lancaster County land area wise, located in the Pequay Creek watershed. And the Pequay Creek is among the highest polluting watersheds in Lancaster County, referenced as a tier 1 top 25% polluting watershed. And I apologize, I should have included this, but if you were to look at a land use map of Lancaster County and specifically the Pequay Creek watershed, you would see that a significant portion of the Pequay Creek watershed is in agricultural land use. And this area of the county, Salisbury Township, really pretty much is the headwaters of the Pequay Creek watershed. There's a little bit of the watershed that begins in Chester County. But ultimately the watershed, for most intents and purposes, pretty much starts in Lancaster County and then ends in Lancaster County when it flows into the Susquehanna River. And specifically this area of the county and Pequay Creek watershed in general, really is home to a very dense population of Plain Sect landowners, Plain Sect farmers. Salisbury Township specifically has about 95% of their farmers are either Plain Sect farmers or Plain Sect landowners, or both. Jeff mentioned this a little bit during the polls, but Lancaster County, again, as a little bit of background, contributes twice as much nitrogen to waterways as any other county in Pennsylvania. So Jeff mentioned really that if we're going to be successful in Chesapeake Bay goals, we do need to be successful in Lancaster County. So zooming in on Salisbury Township and kind of trying to outline what's the problem or what's the challenge here at the beginning of the project. So I misspoke on my last slide there. It's actually the third largest municipality in Lancaster County, represents about 5% of the total land area in the county. As I mentioned, dominated by Plain Sect farmers, 95%, which again, this particular community, the trust has worked with for 30 plus years now. It can be difficult to engage in conservation efforts, slow to adopt change and hesitant to accept funding assistance. A lot of times in this community and where we've been successful is really identifying who those leaders are in that community, starting from the leadership position, and working down from there really is critical. And that goes for all elements of our work, not just conservation work. The township is home to over 200 unique farm operations. It's actually about 500 plus parcels if you look at it from a parcel basis, but farmers are farming multiple parcels as part of their operation. So we determined it's about 200 unique farm operations in the township. So with that in mind, making those sweeping and impactful improvements to water quality could be difficult to achieve. And really the genesis of this project, certainly Chesapeake Bay goals and mission of Lancaster Farmland Trust played a role into this, but where this project really kicked off was driven by Salisbury Township in and of itself. They have goals at the township level that they need to meet municipal stormwater requirements. And township leadership there really took kind of the bull by the horns in this and really backed this project and wanted to get it started. So the township deserves a lot of credit to kickstarting this project, and oftentimes without municipal support, a project like this could fall flat. You can see there on the map on the left, all really just to show all of the green. There are just all of the farm visits that ultimately we were going to complete and then did complete. So you can see kind of the sheer magnitude of the project there.
Hello. Where do we put it? Oh, wait, thank you.
So what's the solution to a challenge kind of this type of magnitude? And we found that to be partnerships. Salisbury Township, their staff and elected officials, while they were backing the project and had the support, they don't have the capacity to really carry out the level of fine detail that's needed to complete the project like this. Same goes for Lancaster Farmland Trust. While we do have a lot of credit in the Plain Sect community, bringing in, the township to the mix and having their backing can really support that project going a long way. And if landowners know the township is on board with the trust, it just really helps propel things forward. And other organizations, Jeff mentioned Team Ag and Red Barn. So those private TSPs, technical service providers, those are really the experts when it comes to the fine details of writing conservation plans and designing best management practices on farms. Lancaster Farmland Trust, while we do have an ag outreach staff that can speak to funding programs and conservation work and generally to best management practices, we currently don't have anybody that's certified as a conservation plan writer, or certainly don't have any agricultural engineers designing these plans. So it's important to have those experts on your team as well, we found. And then in this particular case, we had another group involved, the Environmental Defense Fund. I won't touch on this component of the project just for time's sake today, but the Environmental Defense Fund was critical in this project. Not only did they provide funding to the work, but they also did an interesting study related to the economic return of conservation for dairy farms. They did a case study on a few dairy farms in Salisbury Township to really try to determine what that economic value of conservation work is for a dairy farm. So certainly, and they have a report on that. So it certainly would be something if you're looking for any follow-up information to read and look into. So those partnerships, I talked about roles here a little bit. So basically, Lancaster Farmland Trust, we served as the lead on this project. And really what I mean by that is, being a nonprofit organization, we applied for the grant funding. The project really was funded mostly by a National Fish and Wildlife Foundation grant that really kind of spearheaded it. As I mentioned, the Environmental Defense Fund kicked in some funding as well. So not only were we the project lead in that sense, but we were able to leverage that 30-year relationship that I talked about, kind of that rapport we've built with farmers, and some history of being able to organize community field days and meetings and things like that. And then our staff also, took the role of not only visiting with every farmer in the township, which I'll get into that a little bit later, but also tracking and aggregating all the data. And I think, going into this project, we knew that was going to be an important role, but as we actually got into visiting every farm and tracking conservation plans and tracking potential projects, that really did become more apparent to the partnership here, that data tracking is a critical part and a critical component of achieving any sort of results when it comes to Chesapeake Bay or Pennsylvania watershed implementation plan goals. Is we have to know what's out there, and we have to have an accurate and clear way to track it in order to not only allow farmers to get credit for it, but to determine where we're at, where's our starting point, and where do we need to go. As I mentioned, Salisbury Township served as the critical element for this project's success. A lot of the communications, at least initially in this project, to farmers came from the township, through the township, on township letterhead. The township really initiated a lot of the meetings and things like that. The partnership felt that the communications coming from Salisbury Township rather than from Lancaster Farmland Trust or Team Ag or someone else, it was important to go through the township to show their support. The township also had Jeff mentioned Gordon Hoover. He's on our staff now. Gordon actually used to work for Salisbury Township, was on their staff. So they actually contributed some staff time to this project too. Gordon did the outreach in Salisbury Township, and technically when he was doing that outreach, he was on their staff. He later moved on to our staff and continued the same work, but it just shows their commitment to the project by dedicating a person and some resources towards that. I touched on the Environmental Defense Fund a little bit related to their engagement with ag stakeholders and that economic analysis, and then Team Ag, again, as that technical service provider. And these are, I want to pause here just to make sure I'm not leaving anybody out. Obviously, these are the 4 kind of partners that mostly were included in the grant proposal, but Jeff mentioned the Conservation District, obviously the farmers themselves, DEP, other folks certainly were involved as partners in this particular project that I certainly don't want to exclude them from it. They played critical roles as well. So what was that solution? Kind of this 5-pronged solution we have. We want to elevate the value of conservation. Jeff touched a little bit on this related to climate change. Going out to farmers and speaking to them about making improvements, conservation improvements, best management practice improvements to their farms to improve Chesapeake Bay health and water quality health. That resonates with some farmers, but the vast majority of farmers and oftentimes farmers in the Plain Sect community, it's important to kind of work in their operation into the conversation and how this can be beneficial to their operation, their yields, their efficiencies. So not only are we reducing pollution going into the bay, but we're making your life easier by X, Y, or Z BMP. Building that capacity of trusted farm advisors. We talked on how Lancaster County is responsible for 21% of Pennsylvania's nitrogen reduction goal. So about 21% of the effort really should be in Lancaster County as far as folks out doing this work. And I'd say that's not necessarily the case. There are a few organizations, Lancaster Farmland Trust, Alliance for the Bay, Stroud, the Conservation District, others that are doing this kind of outreach work to farmers. And there's private sector folks, Team Ag's, Red Barn, but really there's not enough boots on the ground really visiting with farmers. And not only, stopping and visiting farmers with once, but what we found is a lot of times that single visit isn't enough. We really need to build a kind of a coalition of trusted farm advisors that are going to be doing kind of more consistent check-ins with farmers related to conservation work. And this could involve BMP verification. But what we don't want to do is, visit a farmer, talk about funding options, get a farmer interested and engaged, and then kind of not follow back up for a couple of years, and who knows what might have changed by then. So we want to build that capacity of folks out on farms and also that consistency. Jeff mentioned, we might have multiple folks coming out from different organizations talking about slightly different programs, but building the consistency, having kind of a dedicated person or group to really be that farmer's go-to person related to conservation. creating some learning farms or demonstration farms. You want to be able to prove to farmers that this stuff works. Some peer-to-peer recommendations. It's one thing for myself to go out there and say, this particular practice will be great for you. We'll pay for it. It's going to improve your operation. But coming from their neighbor who's also a farmer, who they are in church with and they trust more than they trust me, it's really important. And being able to demonstrate that neighborly relation is important. And that really that plays into Gordon's role too as well. Actually, living in the township, being a farmer himself, it builds that clout. Engaging the marketplace. This again was related to the Environmental Defense Fund's work, trying to kind of understand how conservation can impact, consumer decisions, for example. And we're seeing more and more of that, where, as folks might be interested in buying products that are organic, for example, or that are from Pennsylvania, that are grown in Pennsylvania. We're seeing more and more consumers being interested in purchasing products that are from sustainable farms or farms that are engaging in conservation work. And so engaging some of those co-ops, whether it be Land of Lakes or Turkey Hill, or even a company like Hershey, to be able to determine what sort of connection could be there to be able to market the product as coming from a farm that has a fully implemented conservation plan, for example. So, and then similar to kind of learning farms, developing a frolic engagement strategy. So the Plain Sect community, specifically the Amish community, you oftentimes hear the term frolic. Think of, a barn raising, for example, where the entire community gets together and really kind of tackles a whole project and does it all at once and gets it done quickly. So the idea here is tapping into that spirit in that community to be able to achieve some of this conservation work. So seeing your neighbors get plans, seeing your neighbors implement conservation practices, even potentially hosting field days to plant a riparian buffer on a farm, for example, and inviting youth groups or other community members to come out and participate in that was a goal of this project. I will say we obviously hit the hiccup, as everybody else did, with timing when it came to COVID shutdowns, where we weren't able to have as many kind of these large get-togethers and gatherings to implement some of these practices as we had hoped. But certainly I think this could be used moving forward. I talked about all of these different elements. This just kind of goes into the specifics here. So I will breeze past these slides because I've already talked about them. So what did we find to be the keys to success? Finding a local champion. That local champion in our case was Gordon Hoover. He was a neighbor. He was a farmer. He originally was on township staff. He still is an elected official in the township. He's now on our staff, but he's not a stranger to folks in this community. So it's not that somebody from an outsider, quote unquote, can't come in and do it, but it's really it goes a long way to have somebody who is already trusted in the community to be able to sell conservation. Having that municipal backing, harnessing those trusted farm advisors, and rallying the greater community really kind of all play into this. Community conservation, rather than kind of this scattershot approach, is really how it needs to be done in order to really see any sort of meaningful results in our assessment. Here I'll just show some photos and others of different work we had out there in Salisbury Township. Photo on the left is a farmer meeting, really introducing the project. You'll see Gordon there speaking to this group of farmers, introducing the project. Had a really great turnout. As I mentioned, this meeting was really hosted by the township. We felt that seemed to be a successful approach. Parking area there on the right. Some before and after photos of some of those learning farms that we referenced. So the photo on the left there, you can see obviously that pasture needed some attention there. So it's a little bit tough to see, but on the photo on the top right, That would be the after photo. And in the very background behind that silo, you'll see kind of a new roof there that wasn't there. That's a new building there for heifers there that then allowed them to not tear up this field quite as much. So that was an improvement there. And then similarly, bottom left and bottom right, you'll see from the more photos from the same farm with some very kind of degraded heavy use areas there that are pretty well tore up in the bottom left, and then some improvement there on the right. One element that I didn't necessarily touch on is related to that frolic. And what our original plan was for the frolic was focusing on one tributary in the township. This particular stream here is named White Horse Run. It flows directly into the Pequay Creek watershed. So here's some aerial photos we took with our drone, kind of showing different conditions, existing conditions at a few years ago now on the White Horse Run. Some existing buffers, some more mature buffers, some grass buffers, and then obviously some completely unbuffered streams where there's grazing directly up to the stream. Since these photos have been taken, we've actually been able to engage every agricultural landowner, every farm on this stretch of stream here, and have successfully planted or are planning to plant buffers along pretty much this entire stretch of stream. So once that's complete, we'll certainly get some after photos, but it's definitely been a success story, and we're going to try and replicate that on some other tributaries in the township and potentially the county. That was really a group effort between Lancaster Farmland Trust, Stroud Water Research, Alliance for the Chesapeake Bay. We're really all involved with that with some other funding sources, but it really kind of showed that you need multiple players in the game in order to achieve success here. And once the neighbors see their upstream neighbors doing similar work, it does make it oftentimes more likely that they'll participate. Here is a picture of some pictures of a BMP project we did elsewhere in Salisbury Township. This along an unnamed tributary that again flows right into the Pequay Creek watershed. This farm, we also were able to acquire a conservation easement and preserve the farm at the same time that these practices went in. So it makes these practices a little bit more permanent, given that we'll have an easement on the property. So we did plant a buffer. It wasn't quite we're not quite at 35 feet yet. We have 20 feet there. We're hoping we can, the landowner wasn't completely against expanding that in the future. So we think we'll get there, hopefully. Some stream crossings or stream access points for livestock. Oftentimes we include those as part of a riparian buffer and stream bank fencing projects. They give livestock not kind of uncontrolled access to the stream, but one particular area for them to either cross the stream or access the stream for water, but not kind of have access to the entire length of stream. And then on the top right there, you see some stream bank stabilization there. Next, I'm going to show a video that will talk about one specific project. Actually, similarly to the one I just talked about, this farm was preserved at the same time that this project was done. But you'll see, you'll see Gordon Hoover in this video. You'll see some other folks involved as far as TSPs are concerned, and you'll hear the farmer actually talking about the project. This is a Plain Sect, an Amish dairy farmer who actually worked off of the farm for a few years in construction. His dad was still farming, but his dad was getting out of, starting to transition out of farming, decided he was going to sell the dairy herd, sold the dairy herd. And that really just didn't stick right with the son. He wanted to see dairy cows on that farm. That's how he grew up. So he actually left the construction industry, came back to the farm, brought dairy cows back on the farm, but wanted to do so in a responsible way and wanted to make some improvements to mostly to his manure handling. And you'll see that in this next video. And Drew, let me know if it's not showing.
Today we're here visiting the Sook farm. This is a great example of some of the work that we do at Lancaster Farmland Trust, not only in preserving farms, but also trying to preserve the sustainability of those farms we preserve. You can preserve a lot of land, but if you can't continue a sustainable farming operation, you lose the real value of preserving all this valuable historic farmland. We started working with the Zook Farm here in Christiana spring of 2020. And our first visit with the landowner involved discussing his goals for the operation and finding ways that we can maximize the economic performance of the farm and the environmental performance. And we believe we can do both things together. So some of the things we identified early was the need for an additional manure storage. And in this case, it's a slatted underhouse manure storage. The slatted manure storage is an 8-inch thick concrete slat, and there's a manure storage underneath the slats. In this case here, you know, it's 80 feet long, 40 feet wide, and 10 feet deep. And we're holding, again, 3 months of manure storage here, along with the 3 months of manure storage for the dairy cows. So this gives the landowner flexibility of having the dairy manure and the heifer manure combined together and able to agitate it and pump it out, again, every 5 or 6 months. The idea for the heifer underhouse manure pit is it takes less of a footprint from their productive land because it's underneath the barn already. So we don't have to have a round manure pit, for example, outside of the barn that may take half an acre of productive land. We also planned and have installed some grassed waterways, some upslope diversions, where we can divert that water around the heavy use area in a stabilized manner and outlet clean water to the stream. We're not going to stop it from raining, and we're not going to stop water from going downhill, but what we can do is make sure the water that is going to the stream downhill is clean and not contaminated. Our team has a lot of skill sets in grant writing and fundraising. And so this allows us to take those talents and those skill sets and expand it to really offer a complete package to the farmers that we're working with.
The spring was the first that we actually hauled manure out of there, and yeah, it was really nice. Normally I had to haul manure about every 5 weeks, and I was able to hold all winter. So now I'm thinking, I'll easily be able to hold until the corn's off. So we'll be spreading twice a year. I think it was a major improvement as far as contaminated water.
Okay, so yeah, I mean, that was a great example of a particular project that we worked on. The idea there is that not only, like Jeremy mentioned there, you're not taking up any land with a satellite manure pit out in the field. You're storing it under the barn. There's some other heavy use area protections involved there, but kind of the main component there is that now the farmer has adequate manure storage for his operation, where he's able to spread the manure when it's useful to him, and at times where the fields can actually use it, and it's decreasing that chance of some heavy runoff events causing contamination into the stream. So that's really the takeaway there. I see it's 10:30 now, and I want to go ahead and give a chance for any questions that might be available or might be there.
Just to interject there, apologies for everyone. Sort of the audio and the imagery, at least on my edge, was a little off there. We had tested this with Drew previously and thought we had all that figured out. So apologies, it wasn't quite as clean as what it should have been.
Yeah, but I did share the YouTube link. If you want to watch it again on your own time, or if you were interested and want to share it with others. So yeah, as Jeb and Jeff mentioned, we have about 10 minutes for questions. So I know I have a few, but I would certainly want to open up the floor. So you can either drop them in the chat, or you do have the ability to unmute yourself if you'd like to ask a question that way. I can get us started. So really awesome presentation, and you guys are doing amazing work. I'm curious to hear about some of the improvements on the farm, if there's been any noticeable impacts in regards to alleviating negative climate impacts, like, such as flooding events where they weren't as severe as they've been in the past because there's a buffer there. Or have there been any examples like that?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that there, if we went back and looked at some buffers or other elements that were installed, many years ago, we certainly would likely see that. As the case is with a lot of these best management practices, there is a little bit of lag time to where you're actually seeing any real measurable improvements as far as pollution is concerned, whether it be, maybe there's groundwater contamination from kind of the over application of manure over the years, or it takes obviously a few years for trees to become more mature and really for those the positive effects of a buffer really to take place. So that's kind of my thoughts on it. I'm not sure if Jeff has any.
Yeah, I mean, I would just also add to it, historically, every project was sort of one-off. It was, you implemented BMPs on one farm, and then you might have implemented BMPs on another farm, but it was across, the township. It's really only been recently here we've tried to have a coordinated effort locally about trying to look at particular stream segments and get BMPs implemented on all the properties within that stream segment. So I think that the potential is there that we will begin to see that benefit. But right now, with just sort of one-off properties historically, we're probably not experiencing the collective benefit across that we could be. So, my hope is that we do see, reductions in the amount of runoff and flooding, that might be occurring, or amount of suspended sediment in streams as we get, these stream segments with BMPs along the entire reach of those particular sections.
Yeah, and it kind of maybe not necessarily related to actually measuring pollutant loads in streams and actually measuring that water quality, but back to that data tracking that I referenced a little bit, I will say that one element of that we believe will be successful when all data is tracked and entered through this Salisbury Township project will be to get credit, not only for the farmers, but in any particular bay model that might be informing Pennsylvania's water quality reduction goals, but to be able to enter the information or collect that information that we collected from farmers out in the field and enter that into the system to, hopefully to demonstrate that there's more work that has been done that maybe is being input into these models. It's kind of another interesting thing to consider.
I have a quick follow-up question to that. One of the BMPs, best management practices that you mentioned were cover crops. And I know in talking with you, both have learned about the tremendous value that cover crops have to carbon sequestration, which obviously has a direct link to climate. I'm curious, and this could be similar to riparian buffers in that it takes several years to really know the full impact of a buffer. But has there been any effort to understand or to grasp the amount of carbon that's been sequestered due to the increase in proliferation of cover crops through your guys' work? Because that's been, again, I know that might be hard to quantify, but I'm just curious.
Yeah, Drew, I mean, I would say not at this point. It's not, I would say for us at the Trust, sort of a real selling point related to climate, hasn't been there. I mean, that's certainly emerging. And I think there's opportunities for us to quantify those types of things and be able to communicate it, in terms of, what agriculture is doing here in the county related to climate change. But I think the other thing, at least that we have anecdotally heard at this point, is that, there's not farms are small businesses, and farmers are, driven by profit margins, or the ability to make profits. So if markets emerge where, there can be some carbon sequestrated, credits that can be traded or something like that, I think we'll start to see even wider adoption. I mean, I think there's probably roughly 70% of the county already has cover crop and no-till, continuously implemented. I think that's probably a pretty safe number. It's not really reflected in terms of data that's being reported back, but that's probably what the true number is physically out there on the ground. But at the present time, there's no benefit or motivation for a farmer to continue to have that system in place unless they're really committed to it. And we do have examples where, it's been leased land and it was leased by a farmer for 20 years and he was a, solid no-till cover crop guy, got leased to another farmer who wasn't, and went in there and tilled that soil up right away. So, the benefit of all the carbon that was just sequestered over those 20 years is now gone. So, I think that's something we have to work on, especially in terms of the climate element. Is there a system to be put in place? Is there, an economic driver that can be put in place to ensure, at least on a semi temporary basis, maybe it's a 20-year contract or something, where that carbon could be stored and there's some value that can be provided to the farmer for doing that. So I think when we get that figured out, the communication of climate change and carbon sequestration will become a much bigger topic for farmers anyway.
Thanks, Jeff. Yeah, that's really insightful. Certainly, it is a business, right? And so it often comes back to what's even manageable. And you touched upon that in your remarks regarding the cost of implementing some of these BMPs and the need for that assistance, whether from local, state, or federal funding. So we have time for about one more question. So I don't want to monopolize the questions. Certainly, feel free to drop one in the chat or unmute yourself. And I'm sure Jeff and Jeb would love to answer it.
I've got a question related to long-term operation and maintenance on the BMPs and so forth, and how is that addressed in the agricultural communities?
Yeah, so when we have the plans put together, there's an O&M agreement that the landowners commit to. So they take on that responsibility, and the TSPs, engineers are really providing the guidance in terms of what those operation, really the maintenance elements are. Obviously, if it is on a preserve farm, then we're out there once a year. We can sort of verify and check whether or not that maintenance is being completed. I would say I think probably the greatest challenge for farmers is, if a riparian buffer is installed with stream bank fencing as an example, that wasn't there in the past, that's now additional maintenance for them. And whether or not they have the time, capacity, man hours to be able to do that maintenance is always a question. So, locally in the county, there's been efforts to try and get some teams compiled specifically for maintenance related to riparian buffers and stream corridors, because that has been, a known challenge for a lot of years now. That farmers, again, either don't have the time or the capacity to do that type of work. Although I would say, what we've also seen, especially in the Plain Sect community, this interest in riparian buffers and reintroducing wildlife back to it, and some of the younger generations really taking an interest in that, and the older generations passing the responsibility of maintenance on to them to maintain, to go in and mow and remove invasive species and things like that in these buffers, So that's been sort of interesting as well, to see sort of this re-engagement with sort of the natural environment, especially along stream corridors.
Great. I know we're a little over our time, but Tally does have a great question that I've even seen in my time up in Pennsylvania that I'd love for Jeb and Jeff to take a stab at. So the questions regarding generations and if there's any differences between the incoming generation of farmers, the younger ones, and the olders in adopting these BMPs. And I'd also add on to that somewhat hijack Ty's question if there's any climate impacts there too, if the younger generations of farmers have that as part of their decision making.
Yeah, Jeb, do you want to kick it off? And
Sure. To start off, I will say yes. I do believe there is a different mindset with the generational change on farmers, and so there are, the younger generation, even in the Plain Sect community, does at least appear at this point in time to be more willing to at least engage in conversation about, mostly related to different funding sources. Historically, the Plain Sect community has been, fairly against taking funding from government sources, and that's still the case for a lot of Plain Sect farmers. But I'd say more and more you see folks willing to take some of those government funding sources, whether it be from DEP or the State Conservation Commission or another element. But so that's changing a little bit. I mean, a lot of times those decisions are still made by the leaders in the community and the leaders in the church. But as those leaders, change to younger generations as well, we may see some of that begin to change. And I will say, I still don't think, even with the younger generation, there's really the term climate change, I would say, by and large, still really doesn't resonate with the younger generation of Plain Sect farmers. But I will say that at least I've noticed, and I think Gordon would agree, and Jeff would agree, that there's at least a recognition that we are, dealing with, some more intense storm events and kind of some heavier rains that may impact their operation. And so I think there's a recognition of that, and a recognition that there's a part to play for farmers. I would say yes.
And I'll just add on to that quickly. I mean, and I think some of this is consumer driven. It's like organics. We really saw farmers starting to shift to organic production because it was driven by consumers. It's what consumers demanded. And I think as consumers start to demand that farmers are sensitive related to climate change aspects, I think you'll start to see that shift. And I think the younger generations are more apt to recognize and understand that if they want to have a profitable enterprise on their farm, they need to make sure that they can connect with the consumer, and that they're speaking what the consumer, they're doing what the consumer wants to hear. So I think that's really going to drive it. I think the older generations, were very ingrained in this is the way we farmed for decades now, and it's the way I'm going to farm. Plus also with the fact, they've seen the ebb and flow of pressure related to the Chesapeake Bay over the decades. Yes, we're gonna have enforcement on it. Administration changes. No, we're not going to have enforcement. Yes, we're going to have enforcement. No, we're not going to have enforcement. That sort of I've seen over the years just really ingrains them in the spot that they're at, to stand on the sidelines and go, well, I'll wait 4 years to see what happens next. And I'll wait 4 years to see what happens next. I think that has started to change as well.
Really interesting. Well, I know we're at time. Thank you, Jeff and Jeb, so much for your wonderful presentation. Really thrilled to hear about all your great work there in Lancaster, as we noted at the top. Very just critical work that you all are doing. So we do have just a few minutes before our next presentation. So stay tuned for that. Go get your coffee, and we'll be back here at 10:50. I'll share my screens in case, so you don't forget. Thanks, everybody. All right, everybody, welcome back. Long time no see. Excited to introduce our final presenter, going into our final presentation. We've heard three really wonderful projects. We started off with in Virginia, made our way north to Virginia or to Maryland, and then ended just recently in Pennsylvania. And to help bring all this together, I'm really happy to introduce Sarah Bucci, the Director of Strategic Communications at the Water Hub at Climate Nexus. Sarah is going to share more about herself, including her Chesapeake roots and more about the Water Hub. But for those of you who heard her preview on Monday, you know we have a phenomenal presentation in store. As Sarah will share best practices for communicating about climate change with a particular emphasis on the many connections between climate change and our work for clean water. So without further ado, take it away, Sarah.
Great, thanks. Hi, everyone. I am going to share my screen. There we go. And present. Feel free to put stuff in the chat. Drew said he would monitor, so if there are questions or comments that come up, he can make sure that we talk to them. There's a couple of breaks as well as time for questions at the end, but feel free to jump in if something comes to mind. So yeah, I was really excited when Drew asked for us to come and present about the connection between climate and water and communicating. I definitely don't need to tell this group that climate change is in fact water change. And so I know from the presentations that we've heard over this week that y'all are doing a lot of great work to like both adapt to the climate disruption that's kind of already baked into the water systems that we're dealing with, as well as looking at solutions that impact both the quality of the Chesapeake Bay, but also build resilience and reduce pollution. So pretty exciting. Just wanted to give you a sense of what we're going to talk about today. My goal is really connecting the dots between climate and water through a communications lens, and again, talking about how we can leverage the water work that solves many problems at once. So just to introduce myself a little bit, so I am based in Denver, Colorado now, and I'll talk a little bit about the Water Hub and our focus. But I grew up in Maryland, and I went to college in Pennsylvania, and my grandparents are from Western Pennsylvania. And I lived in Richmond for a number of years before moving to Denver. So I used to be a Choose Clean Water member when I worked in Virginia, and I'm excited to be talking to folks who work on Chesapeake Bay issues. I kind of joke about my first act as a water activist was, as a kid, I painted the like Chesapeake Bay drainage don't dump signs on the storm drains in my neighborhood in Gaithersburg. So excited to be talking with you all here. And yeah, I was the state director with Environment Virginia from 2013 to 2017. And that's what I did before I moved out west and focused more on communications specific roles. So before I joined the Water Hub team, I was the communications director with a group called Grid Alternatives, which is a national clean energy equity organization. And now with the Water Hub, focused on making water communications more accessible and activists and advocates more effective, with a focus on the Western United States. So very excited about kind of connecting all of the dots between climate and energy and water. The Water Hub is a project of Climate Nexus, which is also a communications nonprofit whose mission is changing the conversation on climate to inspire, inform, and elevate constructive and equitable climate action. So we are funded by grants, so we're able to provide that free support to our partners. And the Water Hub right now is primarily funded again to work in the Western United States. But I couldn't miss an opportunity to talk to folks working on Chesapeake Bay issues. And I think that a lot of the themes that we see in our work really resonate across the country. So like everyone else, I want to start out with a poll, and this question is going to create a word cloud on my slides if this works correctly. But if folks want to either use this QR code on your phone or hop onto a browser on your computer and go to slido.com and enter the code 839754, we can, it will ask you to put in what words come to mind and pop into your head when you think about climate change. You should be able to put in more than one answer. So I'll leave this up here for a second to let folks get onto the Slido, and please chime in if you're having any trouble accessing the question. And then on my next slide, it should start to create our word cloud with your responses. It says there are no questions. Oh no. Let me.
Yeah, I see it now.
Okay, it doesn't seem. Is it active now? Okay.
Yep.
Great. Maybe I just needed to go into this next slide. Yeah, so if you will go to the Slido, and then hopefully what will happen is as folks enter the words that pop into their head, if there's doubles or triples, it'll do its word cloud magic. See, we've got about 20. So give folks one more second. I'm like a visual learner and thinker, so I find tools like this really like helpful and interesting. So yeah, I can see flooding, scary, overwhelming, sea level rise, heat, fire, hurricane, ocean acidification, words like sad, justice, existential, negative, intensity, fossil fuels, complex, adaptation. Yeah. The thing that's jumping out to me here is a lot of the both the feelings that come from, I'm sure, also working on these issues day in and day out. We've had a lot of extreme weather in our lives and on the news this summer. So that certainly has impacted me. And then the impacts, that's like the thing that I see popping out most, the impacts that we're seeing. Great, well, thank you. Heat islands, intensity. Yeah, and I'm glad we're recording this. I'm gonna take a screenshot of the poll, and I think I'll have a copy in my Slido that we can share after as well. But I find this really interesting and kind of grounding our conversation and how we talk about climate change. So to start out, I'm going to focus on the things that we know about climate communications and focusing on, you know, in many ways, a lot of pretty in-depth public opinion research that has been going on for over a decade now. So folks might be familiar, and I mentioned this on Monday as well, with the Yale program on climate communication. They have been doing research on the 6 Americas, which looks at public opinion around climate change and global warming. So since 2008, Yale and the George Mason program have been tracking this public opinion. And there's a couple of things that I think are quite positive in this chart. So this is the most recent iteration of their analysis of the 6 Americas from 2020, end of 2020, which shows that most Americans are alarmed or concerned about global warming. And that to me is a positive thing. And a strong majority, if you include cautious folks who, have a higher belief in the science are concerned, but maybe not quite as motivated. That's a very strong majority in the country, which I think is pretty positive. And one of the reasons I share this is a core principle of communications is knowing your audience, what your audience already believes, where they're coming from really does impact how you're communicating with them. And so, the rallying cry that you might give to your most ardent supporters around why we've got to act on climate now and actions that they can take to volunteer or, get involved in advocacy or, that might be different than the way you're introducing climate change to a group of students who are learning about it from the first time or working to persuade someone who might be more on the fence about the issue. So I mentioned that I've heard it a ton in the presentations as well about both the different messages that are being delivered as well as the messenger. So, for example, the folks in Lancaster talked about, if you're going to go out and do this outreach around, management best practices to farmers, it's important that someone who actually understands and has real credibility is the one doing the message bringing. So the messenger can often be as important as the message itself. This next slide shows actually how this has changed over the years. The thing that I wanted to point out here is that you can see starting in 2008, that alarmed group was, pretty low in the low 10s and has been the quickest, fastest and most largest growing group of this 6 Americas. And that's something that I think is really important to know. More Americans are alarmed, are motivated to act, are very deeply concerned about the issue. And so that just shows that there's more and more folks who are ready to take action and hear about this. And in fact, earlier this year, the Yale program and the George Mason program just did a deeper dive on this alarmed segment and looking at the folks, again, who are most likely to be engaged with our groups, most likely to be engaged on climate, following the news, engaged in advocacy themselves. And there were a couple of tidbits in here that I thought were really interesting to understand what motivates folks who are really alarmed about climate change and how we can leverage their concern. So they're in kind of segmenting this alarmed group into even smaller groups. They found that there are folks who are willing and then the folks who are really active. So the folks who are really active are the ones who are like already volunteering, already taking action. They're the most kind of politically engaged. And the interesting thing was that was the group that was also most likely to say that they were very or extremely confident that working together, we could affect change at the local, state, and federal government level. So folks who are calling their representatives, showing up to meetings, who are kind of already part of the system, they think it's going to work. They think that we can band together and actually do make positive policy change, which I thought was pretty optimistic. And I was maybe I'd been a little jaded. I was kind of surprised to hear that, but it makes sense. And that of that group as well, they were more likely than the other two segments. So the folks who are the most active were also most likely to say that they're angry, to use words like disgusted, outraged, and that anger was like a real motivating factor for this group. They're pissed off. People feel like they've been left out in the cold. And so a little bit on, this is kind of from the report itself. Americans are increasingly convinced that climate change is a serious problem. It requires large scale action. There are still relatively few people who are fervently demanding leaders act. And so campaigns that are tailored to engage these different segments of this alarmed group can really help promote climate activism and pro-climate behaviors. And so that is, before we leave today, I shared this on Monday, but I'll also share a tip sheet that we put together that has links to these studies and resources. But I do think that this is really interesting research to kind of know and understand what people are thinking and what motivates them. Another interesting research around climate change and public opinion is that you might expect that experiencing extreme weather would have a really big impact on how people perceive or believe in the science of global warming, or that it's happening. And there was some new research that came out this year that showed experiencing extreme weather doesn't necessarily move people to support aggressive climate action. So this is from May 2021, again, from the, I believe from the Yale program and some other research institutions. And they looked at trends in extreme weather and how it tracked with public opinion polling in the same time period. So this was from 2008 to 2015, the data. And they found that existing political beliefs were the factor that contributed the most to how someone interpreted an extreme weather that they might be experiencing. And so I thought this was pretty interesting because I do feel like the toll that the impacts that we see of climate are happening on us would shift public opinion. And it looks like, in fact, that's not exactly the case, at least in this one study. Although the one type of extreme weather that really did seem to impact and affect the belief a person had in global warming was hot, dry days. So people who had lived in places that had experienced extreme heat, heat waves associated with climate change, were actually more likely to shift their belief in it from that experience, which is, I think, kind of interesting. Now, I mention this because, and we'll get into the next slide, I mean, in this year alone, we have been seeing more and more of this extreme weather. So I am curious how this research evolves and if that changes at all. And so one of the reasons I kind of am talking about this research around public opinion on climate before I get into the climate and water connections is that, there is a gap between people who are concerned about climate change and the support for people who are taking action, who are actively involved in kind of pro-climate activism, or who are talking about it with their friends and family. So we see upwards of 60-70% of Americans are concerned about climate change. And even more, there's much more support for individual solutions, overwhelming public support for things like energy efficiency, clean energy, water solutions as well on the individual basis. And the Pew Research Center did a poll in April that found even though upwards of 70% of Americans are concerned about climate change, 80% of American adults say that they rarely or never discuss climate change in their everyday life, which I found really interesting. And that's probably because my small sample size of my life, I talk about it with everybody I know all the time. So, that's definitely, I do this kind of work for a living and have a lot of friends who do as well. And so that's probably why. But I found that really telling. 80% of respondents, of adults, said that they don't ever talk about it in day-to-day life. And there's a lot of research that shows these kind of like deep relational conversations, can really move people and change minds. And so I think as, groups who are working with local communities and have a lot of credibility in the places that we work, there is an opportunity for us to be, as we're talking about this stuff more and more and more, to help kind of shape public opinion and shift it. There's some pretty cool work done by a group called the Climate Advocacy Lab, and they do a lot of research around this stuff. And they worked with the Carnegie Museum of Natural History in Western Pennsylvania on this program called Climate and Rural Systems Partnerships, where they are working with connecting kind of formal and informal educators, artists, farmers, community organizers around these hubs to like build relationships where they can talk more about climate change in their everyday life. And one of the things that they found is people felt like it broke through this silence of like knowing other people care about it and want to do something about it, actually made people feel less isolated and more interested and willing to talk about it, which was kind of interesting, I thought. So I showed the research that showed, at least through 2015, extreme weather didn't seem to impact public opinion on whether people believe in climate change or what they think about it. But this year alone just feels like it has been an onslaught of, an onslaught of news and an onslaught of extreme weather events. And, we had the deep freeze in the South in the beginning of the year, flooding in the Midwest, heat domes out West, flooding in the Midwest, the heat domes we've been experiencing out West, extreme drought, living here in Colorado, and just the recent hurricanes, Hurricane Ida. I know we have our hurricane or tropical storm that's like hitting the Texas and Louisiana coast as we speak, and many of those storms will reach up into the Chesapeake Bay region. So the Water Hub did our last, we do regular public polling as well around these issues, and our spring 2021 poll, so from March of this year, found that voters across the United States are experiencing the impacts of climate change in different ways. That's not surprising information. But most everyone said that they are experiencing these impacts more acutely than ever. So we, in our study, did ask about voters' experiences with different kinds of extreme weather events. And so of our findings, almost 60% of voters who are from the Western region said that they have experienced wildfires. They were more than twice as likely as voters in any other region to say that they have experienced drought recently. For the Bay Staters, we had kind of split up these regions into South, Northeast. We didn't have a Mid-Atlantic. And this is kind of how people self-identified. But, I think it's still relevant. A majority of voters in the South, nearly half of voters in the Northeast said that they felt they had been experiencing stronger storms. And when asked about the severity of these events in the local area, almost 60% of voters agreed, who had said that those storms severity had increased. They said, so more than half said that they believed that it was because that severity had increased and that had gotten worse because of climate change. They identified climate change as a major or minor influence on those things. So extreme heat was the most, over 80% of voters were like, extreme heat is worse because of climate change. But it was, over 75% for drought, stronger storms, wildfire, increased flooding. And voters across the US also agree that extreme weather poses a threat to public health and to safety and to the economy. So just boiling it down to say, the way people really are experiencing climate change is through weather and water. And so I think that's why water organizations are really important communicators about this. So what does the public think about water? You may know this, but water is a winner. I think Drew even said this when he kicked us off on Monday. So the Gallup has done an annual poll for the last 25 years, and every year for the last 25 years, water pollution has polled as the top environmental concern for people living in the US. While public opinion on climate change is still polarized, in many ways, concern for healthy rivers, safe drinking water, support for regulating pollution, it remains bipartisan. It crosses party lines and other demographics. It's something that we kind of all agree on. And so I think that's really important because water is a good way in to talk about these issues. People really care. They have a strong personal connection that they care about. You know, we need clean drinking water to survive. It's just something that really does unite us, as cheesy as that sounds. Investing in water is also really popular. So in our same poll from March 2021, we found overwhelming support across party affiliation for investing in water infrastructure. 78% of voters agreed that when asked specifically around what President Biden should prioritize in his economic stimulus, 78% supported increasing federal spending on water. More than 9 in 10 voters, at 93%, agreed fixing outdated and unsafe drinking water systems should be a priority. And we asked this because in March of this year, we wanted to inform advocates, policymakers ahead of the infrastructure negotiations that are happening right now. In this question, we left water infrastructure. It's up to the interviewee how they want to interpret that question. I think a lot of people, when they hear water infrastructure, they think about replacing lead pipes, updating the way we move water around, updating drinking water treatment, stormwater systems. But I do get in the next question into more green natural infrastructure too, which people also really support. The Senate infrastructure deal and then the current budget reconciliation negotiations that are happening right now in Congress do both include a lot for water. I know Drew had sent me some information about what's included for the Chesapeake Bay. It was like 238 million for the Bay, which should be more. So I'm hoping they can get more money for that. There was 8.3 billion for Western water infrastructure. There's also some emphasis on climate resilience, protecting headwaters in the West. We're working right now, the Water Hub is working with a coalition called the Water Equity and Climate Resilience Caucus, which is focused on getting water affordability program included in the reconciliation bill. So ensuring that we can, that people have access to affordable water as we do these upgrades, as well as funding for, lead pipe removal and things like that. So in the next question, we asked about the importance of different types of investments in water solutions. So there is a strong majority for support for a lot of different kinds of water solutions. People really care about their drinking water. They care about protecting and restoring rivers, lakes, and streams. But there's also pretty strong majority support for things like helping communities prepare for future floods and droughts, building infrastructure that is future-proof, that will withstand storms, fires, floods, heat, and as well as things like creating more green space. So the thing that I just really love about the projects that we've heard about and that I keep harping on is like the ability to solve multiple problems at once. And so I think that's something that's really popular with people. I have some more good news. Voters also support solutions that prioritize the communities who have been impacted by environmental injustice. So our polling found, again, a strong majority of voters agreed resources should be prioritized in communities that have experienced harm rather than distributed equally among all communities. One of the, in fact, when I get into the recommendations, I'm going to cite another report that the Water Hub put out this year called The Opportunity on Water, which will be shared as well. And so I'm going to quote from that report. Unsurprisingly, since their communities bear the brunt of water problems, voters of color indicate the strongest support for water solutions. More than 90% of Latinos believe it is important for the president and Congress to protect drinking water from contamination, and Black voters are most likely to support a review of Trump policies that harmed the environment. These water solutions are also climate solutions. Again, I don't need to tell this group that, these things are super connected. We often talk about water, I think, in terms of adapting to the climate impacts, but it's a lot more than that as well. The fossil fuels, that extracting and burning fossil fuels that are creating climate change also contribute to local air and water pollution. The wetlands protect against flooding and storm surge and help with that adaptation. But there are also water solutions that will mitigate climate change. Farming practices that are water smart have other efficiency benefits. How we heat, treat, and move water around can reduce the amount of energy and fossil fuel powered energy that we need. There have been some interesting studies in California that showed water efficiency is actually one of the best ways to save energy. Having more efficient uses in our homes and having to use less because it takes a lot of energy, especially out west. I know out east, you guys are often inundated with more water than you can handle, but out west, we pump a lot of water around. A lot of people live in the places where there is no water. And, in Southern California, we're piping water over from the Colorado River Basin or from Northern California, for example. Here where I live in Denver, half of our water supply comes from the other side of the Continental Divide. So by using less and using water efficiently, we can actually reduce the amount of energy that we need within our water system, which I think is pretty great. Okay, I wanted to pause before I get into our conversation around messages that work and best practices to see if we had any questions that I should talk about now.
We didn't have a ton of questions dropped in the chat, but lots of folks have been dropping in insightful comments. But there's one from Tally that might be worth addressing regarding the relationship between the alarmed, concerned population going back to the Six Americas and the extent to which there are the political business leaders, decision makers that have the ability to actually make an impact when it comes to advocacy decisions.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I don't know if that research has been done to put policy to see where policymakers fall within the Six Americas. That would actually be super interesting to see. What I do think is, so there's kind of two things I think about when I think about social movements and long-term change is one, you have to build get to the social change tipping point where something becomes where something becomes the modus operandi, the thing that you just have to do. And there is a lot of research around you need actually a smaller segment of a population to be really, 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 really riled up about something before it kind of tips over into the general consciousness. And I think that kind of growth of that alarm segment shows that we are getting into that place around climate action, which is pretty, I feel that makes me feel optimistic. And then there's also the okay, you've got to do the work to kind of influence the people in power, but then you also, maybe you just need to change the people who are in power so that they, they are on the page with making sure they're on the right page with these things. Yeah, that's a really good question. So I don't know for sure. And I can do some research to see if there has been any studies on that. And that would be interesting to know. But my guess is that probably tracks with the kind of general population. But I could be wrong.
Kind of going off, we had a couple people comment about the personal decisions people can make, whether it's their dietary habits, transportation, all those sorts of decisions. Has there been any insight into the 6 Americas that, if they are alarmed, you're more likely to compost? I would imagine so, but I'm curious if there's been any research to that effect.
Yeah, I think so. I don't want to speak out of turn, not knowing the exact answer, but I do think that the folks who, and I do think they looked particularly at political engagement when they looked at and kind of increasing those, looking at that alarm segment when they did that deeper dive study earlier this year. And I'll share the link to, they do a really good recaps, pretty regularly updating with here's the current state of the current, kind of polling research. But yeah, I would guess that makes sense. I think there's also a lot of, and I think we come across this every day where climate change feels like this big problem. And so a lot of us are probably trying to do what we can in our own lives to contribute, but it often feels like, individualism is kind of almost like something. I think there's been some research around the fossil fuel industry, has done campaigning, marketing campaigning to make people feel individual actions, what needs to happen to basically get off the hook for being the main culprit behind the pollution that's driving climate change. And so I do know that there's some research looking at how people feel, whether people feel hopeless or they feel collective action can work. And so the thing that I mentioned that I think is most interesting about that kind of most active and alarmed group is that they're also the most likely to think that if we band together, we can actually enact change on a policy level, which I thought was pretty cool. And that's the thing that, in addition to us all doing what we can in our own lives, that's the thing that's probably the most needed. Anything else from the chat before we?
No, I think we're good to go.
Okay, cool. All right, so now we're going to get into some of the best practices around talking about these issues. So one of the first points is we really believe in order to harness strong support, really for any campaign, we have to get people's heads nodding and hearts pumping. We have to talk to people where they're at and lead with values. And so I love this organization called the Opportunity Agenda. They have a really good framework for developing messages that they call VPSA, but is value, problem, solution, action. And they talk about designing communications that connect with universal values. So things like health, safety, family, financial security, while also tailoring. And we talked about kind of the different audiences you're going to talk to about different things. So tailoring to the audience's specific concerns. Again, in the resources that I'll share, once I stop sharing my screen, I include a link to the Opportunity Agenda's VPSA message development worksheet. This is just a worksheet that I love. And so highly encourage you all when you're thinking about how you're going to frame a campaign or talk about an issue to really sit down and think about the values that will ground you and connect you with the people that you're trying to reach and the audience that you're trying to reach. If you get stuck with that, my kind of brainstorm question, if I'm ever kind of stuck on what are the values that I'm really trying to tap into here, is to just ask myself, how would I describe the world that I want to live in? And that's usually where I start, kind of that long-term vision. So other examples of like values you can tap into are like community, heritage, protecting the environment for future generations, public, health. Again, I think I mentioned at the beginning. So again, this is a great resource, and highly recommend this organization. And all of these best practices are things that I'm sharing that are included in the Water Hub's Opportunity on Water report. We wrote this report, our managing director wrote this report earlier this year, really seeing that, again, water is climate change, and there's a lot of conversation about climate change, but sometimes water and climate get kind of like siloed into different conversations, when in fact they should all be part of the same conversation in some ways. And it's things like funders really care about climate and resilience. With the new Biden administration, these are like resilience in particular. This has been a buzzword that has been really important to like funders and policymakers, and is kind of more in the public consciousness. And so we wanted to make the case that both for why and also how to center water and water equity in these conversations. And then we end with some recommendations. We have two versions of this report, one that's more for advocates and programs, organizations, philanthropies, and then one that's for policymakers. And so those are both on our site, and we'll be sharing them in the resources as well. But these recommendations can kind of all stem from that report. I'm wondering, I can't actually see, so maybe Drew can check in the chat. I imagine people have seen this image before, and then I would love to get like a anecdotal poll of who has seen this before. Maybe you can just put yes or no in the chat, and we can see. I can open the chat. Oh yeah, it was on the stuff. So this is the climate stripes that's become, I've seen it on like meteorologists wearing the stripes on their ties when they're doing stories, which is kind of interesting. But this is a really cool visual. So I think a lot of us have seen this is the actual visual for the global temperatures for Washington, D.C. from 1895 to 2020. And it really tells the story of like, this is the annual temperature, the average annual temperature in Washington, D.C. over the last, 100+ years. And a lot of us have seen the chart that's like the hockey puck that shows kind of the increase in global temperatures over the same time period. And one thing that the man, I think his name's Ed Hawkins, I don't have it right in front of me, so I hope that's right, who created this visual, is that in that chart, and I think a lot of us understand the the signal and the noise that comes from scientific research. So in that chart, there's like ups and downs in terms of like an average global temperature, but we can see that the trend is clearly going up. And what the person who created this visual wanted to do was kind of take some of that noise out and just create a very impactful way that you could tell the story of global temperatures over the last 100 years in one image. You don't need words to know what this is about. And I think that's really cool. The other thing that I want to talk about, how are we on time? Okay, we're doing okay, is arts and culture. So we often say we need to think beyond fact sheets and op-eds and infographics and actually explore arts and cultural strategies that move people. And so one example of this, and I'm gonna actually share the music video from this one song, is we work with a group called Azul, who does advocacy work with the Latinx community. They're based in California, but they work nationally on ocean pollution issues. They are working to promote the 30 by 30, protecting 30% of our land and water campaign. And what they really wanted to do was create some cultural organizing that celebrated the community of oceans advocates that they work with, and also to be able to use it as a call to action on their campaign. And so they actually worked with a number of artists to create a full-length album called NLMR. It's beautiful music. I actually listen to it quite a bit while I'm working because it's like it's good flow. But so I'm gonna actually go to watch the 1 minute version of this video for us. And Drew, please pipe up if you can't hear.
En el mar la vida es más sabrosa y en el mar te quiero mucho más. Con el sol, la luna y las estrellas.
Oh no, I'm buffering. I'm sorry.
En el mar la vida es más sabrosa y en el mar te quiero mucho más. Con el sol, la luna y las estrellas, en el mar todo es felicidad.
Cool. So one of the reasons I share that specifically is because, as we talked about and in the word cloud, there's a lot of like doom and gloom when we talk about climate change. There was a lot of words about the extreme impacts that people are facing, feeling scary, overwhelmed. And a lot of the work that we do is really hopeful. It's really solutions oriented. It's really connected with place and people and community. And one of the things that I really love about Azul's work is they are so good at tapping into the joy that comes from building a community of people working together towards a goal, towards, in this case, working on conserving land and water, and the feeling that brings to people. And it makes it fun. It makes it fun to be part of the community. It makes it fun to be, involved in this kind of action. And so, I think it's just like a really cool case. It took them, many years from the original idea to putting the music together. They worked with like a full band, and it took a lot of time and energy and many years from idea to the final release of this album that happened earlier this year. But I think it's just a really cool case for the importance of like arts and cultural organizing that we can do. We heard on Monday, the folks in Virginia who are doing their living lab are going to include visuals and arts like in their building as a way to, help tell the story of what they're trying to do. So I just think that sometimes it's really, this stuff like the creativity is, I'm like awe-inspired by it. And I know it can be really hard, and it's often easier to go with like facts and figures, but I think there's something really to incorporating this kind of community building into our work as well. The next is talking about progress over process. I'm pretty sure in this, this is Taraji B. Henson talking about the Hidden Figures movie from like the Oscars red carpet or something. But I liked the quote, so I'm including it. The IPCC, that report that came out this year made it pretty clear. There's climate disruption that's like baked into the system right now. There's a lot we can do to decide like what level of degrees we're gonna, kind of hold ourselves to protect things from getting worse and worse and worse. But there is some amount of climate change that we have to adapt to now. There's resilience that we need to build into our communities in that phase, while we're doing everything we can to slow even worse and even more global warming. And so the climate benefits of water solutions are something that we can really focus on. And so we think that on the problems piece, if you are talking about the problems, I think it's really important to develop messaging and materials that emphasizes the root causes of the problems that we can anticipate, and then focus on the steps we can take to prepare and prevent them in the future. And we also want to paint a vivid picture of the way proposed solutions will help. So for example, we can talk about, oh, we need more green infrastructure. What does that actually mean? How can we paint a picture for people about what the streetscape will be like, how it will change, and what benefits they'll see. So, creating green alleys will capture the rain. So it reduces floodings when we have extreme precipitation events, but it also cools and freshens the air. Having more plants and replacing plants with pavement will reduce the kind of heat island effect that can happen. It attracts birds and butterflies and offers a pleasant place and a safe place often for people to walk or get around. So that's what I mean when I talk about kind of progress over process. And in the same vein, we say like, the why matters more than the how. So for example, and this will also be a link to this campaign will also be in the resource page that I share. But we worked on a campaign that we call Water at Work, which wanted to show the positive impacts on communities, and especially around job creation, that investing in water infrastructure would have kind of around this national infrastructure push. And so we worked with an illustrator to create 6 different vignettes and images of different folks doing water work. We have images of training and workforce development, lead pipe removal, and then other things showing green infrastructure like rain barrels, rain gardens, natural infrastructure like watershed protection, source water protection, excuse me. And we really wanted to focus on the why, because I think there's a lot of, especially when there's like the news about like things happening in DC, it gets into this, like they get into these real process stories. It's like, okay, some Democrats said X, some Republicans said Y. And those things certainly matter and that coverage matters, but we really wanted to focus on the why. What is going to happen if we invest $45 billion in replacing lead pipes across the country? We're going to create a lot of job opportunities that have low barriers to entry, working with utilities on that program. And those folks are going to be protecting the public health of their homes and their neighbors' homes, because they're going to be removing a toxin from the water supply. It's pretty cool. So that is just one example of why really focusing on why we're doing something can be really impactful. And I think that's it in terms of my presentation. So I wanted to leave time, I think we have 10-ish minutes or so, to both like talk about, and I think I'll just stop sharing my screen, but we can either talk about like how some of the projects that we've heard about this week kind of connect with these best practices. I heard a lot about the multi-benefit projects, using imagery and art, talking about really tapping into values people care about. So we can talk about that, or if people have questions, we can just use the time for Q&A. But that's my presentation.
Wonderful. You already have an early adoptee of the climate stripes with Tally changing her profile picture. I love it.
I know I need to put my gallery view back on. It's been, I do hate about presenting as you can't see anyone or the chat. Yes, let me actually, I see Rachel asking about the images available. I am going to find my link to the resource page that has all these, and then I'll actually, we can just share the slides, I think, as well, Drew, if people want them, if you're doing any follow-ups. So
Yep, yeah, definitely.
let me find the link to my resource page too, which I had up and now, oh, I see a climate stripes mask or a tie-dye mask of some kind. That's very cool. It is a nice, Sylvia. Yeah, it's like, Drew is the one who actually suggested I include that in the presentation. It is like honestly just one of the coolest visualizations. Like data visualization is like, I can nerd out about that for forever.
Sarah, we did have one good question. You touched upon the equity and justice elements of climate change. We had a question from Camille about making sure that our messages are accessible to everyone. I'm wondering about how some climate campaigns, if they really consider folks with disabilities, such as folks in the deaf community, blind community, etc. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I really like that. I mean, there's a couple of fronts, and I have to admit, this is like a place where I am definitely learning and growing as a communicator. And is definitely like a place that I have a lot of room, and I think it's like a really good question. The thing that I'm most familiar with is on the digital accessibility front. So there's actually a lot of really good tools to look at making sure that digital communications are really accessible to people. So one example of this is like using alt text on images that you have on your website, that you have in PDFs, that you have on social media. Those are used by folks who use screen readers to use the internet. And so that is how, and there's really good tips on there's a couple of good resources. I can look it up and send them to Drew to maybe include in some follow-up, or I'll just put my email too in the chat. But I think that's a good place to start. If there's like tools you can use to do basically like an accessibility audit of your website. There's a lot of things around like contrast between text and background colors to make sure that folks who have color blindness are able to like easily see images, and then on PDFs too. I still use PDFs all the time, and there's actually on Adobe like a accessibility scan that Adobe will do on your PDF, so you can make sure that you're not missing anything in your PDF if you're sharing that. So there's a lot of things there. I think in terms of like live events, I've been going to more and more events that do include that I kind of ask in the registration, like what accommodations people need to be able to participate, and making sure that those are accessible. So things like having folks doing sign and then closed captioning, having a different languages. So I've been at events recently where and it worked pretty seamlessly. I don't actually know how this technology works, but where they had breakout rooms where folks were either getting the presentation in different languages, or there was a interpreter who was like basically able to, the live ones I think can be like, sometimes they can come up with really fun interpretations of what people are saying. I think there's like different services, but if you're you can get an event transcribed on Zoom so that afterwards, when you publish it, you can publish a link to the transcript so people can read it instead of having to hear it. There's a lot of, I think there's a lot out there that definitely is. Yes, I can share. Hold on one second. I just had the link. Did I put it in the chat? Am I losing my mind? Okay, I put this resource page I'll put it in the chat again. It's a bit.ly link to a one-pager, and that has all the links. So it has the VPSA worksheet in there. It has a link to the examples as well. And I see Melissa's question. Can you talk a little bit about how to be a helpful resource to reporters and media outlets as another means to help shape the narrative? Yes, I absolutely can. That's like a whole other training. But, you know, I think that there's a couple of things that we can do. So we know like the news coverage is often shaping how people think and perceive about the issues, you know, whether reporters are connecting the dots between what's happened, or whether you want them to or not, I guess, depending on who you're trying to reach, between the work that you're doing in climate change, climate resilience, and mitigation and adaptation. And so I think that kind of picking, so I kind of work in a role now where I'm, I mean, basically like a pro bono consultant. So I'm supporting other groups and achieving their goals, but I used to do in-house communications. And I think the main thing to think about in this is really honing in on your goals and your priorities, because there's like a bajillion things you could be sending to like reporters that you're trying to cultivate who are covering your beat and who are or covering the region that you're working in. And so knowing like, okay, here are the 3 things that we really want. If people know anything about this issue we're working on or this project, like here are the things we want them to really get out of it. And then using the opportunities when you have, you know, key moments in like a project, like breaking ground or completing a project, or you've done some kind of study that shows the like efficacy of something, or you're having an event, or you know, other research, and using those moments to continue to kind of cultivate. I think that kind of thing, like becoming the source where you're doing less of the outreach and you're going to kind of more incoming, like, hey, I want to know about how to think about this issue from a reporter, like that takes a lot of kind of time and honestly relationship building and cultivation. So I think identifying the like, here are the 2 or 3 things that I really want people to know, and I want to emphasize in the stories that are covering this issue. And here's the list of like the 10 reporters that are really important to the work that I'm doing, and just kind of think about it almost like donor cultivation, to be honest, where you're in regular touch, you're, you know, not in a fake way, but like being a resource, letting them know that you're there, connecting them to other people that they can talk to, other research that you see that might interest them. If you see a story that maybe misses the mark or could use a follow-up, like using that as an opportunity. I hope that helps answer your question, Melissa. But that's basically what kind of the tactics that we use to try to be a resource, especially is like at the Water Hub, we're kind of an intermediary organization. So we do, you know, get a fair bit of incoming from reporters that we've worked with or connected with sources like, hey, I'm working on this issue, like who should I be talking to? And so I think that's something you can do through cultivation cool, great. Yeah, so like seat yourself as that kind of like go-to source. And it's not just that you have to comment on everything. It's also kind of pointing them in the direction of people and stories that you think are going to help create the narrative you want. I think we got through everything.
Yeah, and just want to point out, I noticed there's a closed captioning option on Zoom. So I clicked it just a few minutes ago when we were talking about that. And it's done a pretty good job in terms of not butchering words. It even spelled out bajillion when you said that, Sarah. So
that's incredible.
Yeah. There's you kind of what you alluded to, on the same space as you in regards to there's always room to grow, lots of room to grow when it comes to particularly the accessibility side of communicating. We do have time for another question, if anyone wants to throw one out. All right, well, don't leave just yet. Do want to take a moment and just thank Sarah so much for her time and insight and tips and expertise sharing all of that with us this morning. Really grateful. I know I learned a ton, and I'm looking forward to sharing the resources that you mentioned. And I'm going to share my screen now because I have just one quick thing I want to throw out before we wrap up. Minimize these. So as I mentioned at the beginning, we have our evaluation. We really do find that it's a very important resource for us, and we do look at it closely. So I'm going to drop in these 2 links in the chat so that everyone can access both the evaluation and the resources. What are the resources? Those are all the slides from the presentations. What else? What other good stuff we have in here? Let me pull it up. I pulled this together yesterday. So all the slides, the worksheet that Sarah dropped in the chat, that's in there too. As I dropped in the chat earlier, there uploaded the recording from Monday's presentations, and I'm going to upload this presentation too. So once those two are both ready to go, I'll upload that into this this folder as well. And lastly, I've just seen all these great resources folks have been sharing in the chat. So something else I'm going to add this afternoon to this folder is the chat, so that folks can go back and, you know, I know I'm going to have to look up that How to Save the Planet podcast. So thanks to everyone for participating and being active and engaged through the chat. So last but not least, want to thank starting off with National Fish and Wildlife Foundation for making this training possible, and then all of our presenters, Joe Rieger, Ali Gallagher, Natalie Cohen, Jeff Swinehart, Jeb Musser, and last but not least, Sarah Bucci for just the phenomenal presentations. I hope that this helped both. I hope these 2 mornings helped both inspire and encourage your organization to talk about the intersection of climate change and clean water, how our work for clean water and restoring and protecting the bay and its rivers and streams is climate change work, so that when you're writing that next grant proposal, that when you're communicating with your members, when you're talking to your policymakers, the local, state, or federal level, you can highlight how this work you're doing has a climate change impact, has significant climate change impacts. I hope that can be helpful, and then I hope that Sarah's presentation can provide you some useful and helpful tips to be more effective at speaking at that intersection. So with that, I'll wrap it up and say thank you again for attending. Please feel free. I'll drop my email in the chat. If you have any other questions or resources that you're looking for, please feel free to reach out. Otherwise, I hope to see you all soon, and hopefully our next training will be in person. See all your smiling faces. Right. Thanks, everybody.